Travel initiated.
When I first played the original Dead Space back in 2020, what struck me the most was how intense it was. If you want to see an excellent example of how good art direction trumps cutting-edge visuals, this is it. Now, you could make a solid argument for the sequel being superior in many ways, which I did in my Dead Space 2 review, but there's nothing quite like the original experience. When it was announced in 2021 that Dead Space was being remade, I have to admit that I was kind of skeptical. The original is starting to show its age for sure, but it's still very playable, and most importantly, it's still scary. Better graphics and more immersive sound design would be nice, but do they really warrant a remake? Capcom has proven that it is possible to successfully modernize a classic, and for it to be hugely profitable. However, this is only the second game from Motive Studios. I'm not counting Battlefront 2 because they weren't the solo developer. And survival horror is worlds apart from Star Wars. Hell, even the team that made the original Dead Space couldn't recapture what made it special, as seen with the Callisto Protocol. So I had some legitimate concerns as I turned off the lights, slipped on my favourite headset and fired up the PS5 to play this. The trailer had already shown that this remake was going to keep many of the iconic moments from the original, so would this be a simple visual uplift, or did the team at Motive reach for something more? And if so, in what way? By the time the Dead Space remake launches, the franchise will have lain dormant for just shy of a decade. For a long time, it seemed unlikely that we were ever going to get another game in the series. Dead Space 3 and its poorly implemented microtransactions basically killed the franchise, and the fact that the original trilogy wasn't ported to the PS4 or Xbox One meant that these games had skipped an entire generation. The Dead Space games were never highly profitable either. They sold well enough, but they were also extremely expensive to make. So taking a gamble on resurrecting this dead IP undoubtedly came with risks. Not only was there no guarantee it would sell, but over the past 15 years a pretty dedicated cult following has formed around the original games. This meant that anything new would have to be really good not to piss off the fandom. I can't speak for the die-hard fans, but I think this is an outstanding remake that should satisfy new and old players alike. It's faithful to the source material and innovative in a way that makes it feel both familiar and fresh at the same time. Now, because this is a remake of a game that I've played recently, I'm going to make loads of comparisons. That doesn't mean that this review is exclusively for those who've played the 2008 game. There are clearly two distinct audiences for this remake, and I'll do my best to service the newbies too by evaluating the game on its own merits. I want to start by discussing the story because this part of the game has seen the most changes. The story itself has remained largely the same. You control Isaac, an engineer responsible for ship maintenance. He's not some highly trained super soldier equipped with an arsenal of high-tech weapons. He's an everyman using whatever equipment that's on hand to get the job done. The story starts aboard the USG Kellion, an emergency maintenance ship that is responding to a distress call from the USG Ishimura, a huge industrial ship designed for planet cracking, which is a type of interstellar mining on a massive scale. The Kellion crashes into the Ishimura while attempting to dock, and although your team survives the crash, it doesn't take long before they realise that their problems have only just begun. The crew of 1,000 have vanished, and in their place is an army of demonic terrors that want to tear your face off and make sweet love to your corpse. While the story is more or less the same as it was in the original, the way that it's told is very different. The main difference is that Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist, and I'm guessing this is going to be a pretty polarising change. On one hand, the game is more closely aligned with the sequels, and maybe this was a deliberate choice for when the inevitable Dead Space 2 remake happens. On the other hand though, it does deviate from the original experience in quite a profound way. I don't usually like the silent protagonist approach, but in the first Dead Space, it really helps emphasize how alone you are. You don't even have your own soliloquy to keep you company. For most of the game, it's just you and the haunting sounds of the Ishimura, and this was really effective at putting you in Isaac's shoes. Having Isaac speak does make interacting with other characters better though, I think. NPCs don't simply monologue at you in weird, unnatural conversations, and overall the storytelling feels less wooden. And yes, Gunnar Wright, who voices Isaac in Dead Space 2 and 3, has returned to the role. I can understand why they decided to make this change. It's the same reason they made the same change for the sequel back in the day. And while I appreciate that it won't be a choice that everyone approves of, I think it works. There are other significant changes too, like new side quests and logs to find that flesh out the story further. Some of the secondary characters have also been given more screen time, or in some cases screen time when they didn't have any before. Environmental storytelling played an important role in the original game, and the same is true here. Fans of Dead Space 2 and 3 will also notice that there are heaps of references to those games throughout. I guess fans of the original might take issue with these additions in the same way that fans of the OG Star Wars trilogy hate the edits made over the years. I think they've been handled really well though, and I appreciate the effort to add more substance because it's such an interesting universe. If more lore and more detail is what you craved from the 2008 game, then the remake has got it in spades. Motive has said that the most important goal for the remake was to honour the legacy of the original. Beyond this, there were 3 key areas they wanted to enhance: horror, the unbroken experience, and creative gameplay. They wanted the game to feel familiar for returning players, but at the same time include new surprises. I didn't know this before I started playing, and for the first couple of hours I was like, it seems like a one-to-one remake of the original, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, I was just kind of hoping for more. And at almost the exact moment I was thinking this, the game was like, oh yeah, by the way, Isaac has thrusters now. Enjoy! So Isaac can use his thrusters in 0G sections, much like he can in Dead Space 2. I know that the original gravity boots aren't a universally loved mechanic, but it's kind of sad to see them go. That said, being able to move freely in space makes many of these familiar environments and missions feel new, and you can go places you never could before. The missions where you use 0G have been modified with this in mind, and I think retrofitting this was a really good call. This is part of a broader change that gives the player more agency. The original Dead Space was pretty linear. Objectives had to be completed in a set order, and while there was a small amount of backtracking, for the most part there was one direction to push through, with previous sections becoming inaccessible as you progressed. Things have changed here. The Ishimura is now one interconnected space, rather than sections you tackle in isolation. This allows you to return to previous areas for items you may have missed, and a reason that you may have missed them is that there are now areas and containers that are locked behind security access requirements. As you play, your security access level increases, allowing you to unlock doors and open containers. Along with ammo, health and credits, there are some interesting upgrades to find, so there are plenty of reasons to return to previously explored areas for things you couldn't grab the first time. This system replaces the previous system where you could spend nodes to access locked doors. As much as I like the new security access system, it's kind of disappointing that node-locked rooms have been removed, because I liked having to choose between unlocking a door or upgrading my gear. As I just alluded to, the upgrade system has also seen a few changes. It operates in the same way as before, allowing you to upgrade Isaac's suit and weapons by making strategic choices about how to spend upgrade nodes. Although now you can unlock new ability paths by finding and purchasing upgrades. This is really awesome. I already liked how this system worked, and now that you can essentially pimp it by finding upgrades is yet another reason to wander off the beaten path. You see, one of the things I love most about Resident Evil 2, which is possibly the greatest modern survival horror, is that you can choose your own path. You can choose to take the fast and dangerous route, or you can take the longer but safer way around. This requires map memorization, and when you master the labyrinth and figure out its secrets, this gives you a huge sense of achievement. Motive hasn't completely achieved the same feeling here, but it's damn close. Being able to access every part of the ship you've been to, and there being value in doing so, makes the Ishimura feel so much more immersive and rewarding. Combat is probably the area that has seen the least amount of change, and this is a good thing. You have a number of nasty tools at your disposal, which all have a primary and a secondary mode. You don't need to use all of them either. If you fall in love with the plasma cutter and just want to sink all your upgrade nodes into it, that's totally your prerogative. I played through on hard, which is my recommendation. Hard isn't super challenging. The reason I think it's the way to go is that resource management is essential, and for me, this is a non-negotiable in survival horror. On hard, you're always running low on something, and this forces you to get creative and use objects in the environment, like metal rods, explosive canisters, and even the pointy bits left over from dismembered enemies. There's a number of new puzzles here too. I thought the puzzles in the OG game were good, but kind of easy. The new puzzles aren't all that difficult, but as someone who loves puzzles in survival horror games, they're a very welcome addition. The changes made to movement in 0G also have a pretty big impact on some of the larger environmental puzzles. One area I was hoping would be overhauled was the boss fights. I didn't think they really fit into the combat in the original, and I have the same issue with them here. You can't cheese them like you could in the original though, so at least they're a fraction more interesting this time. Overall, the moment-to-moment gameplay is excellent. There's a perfect cadence of combat, problem solving, and exploration. Motive has done a great job at making the different gameplay styles feel cohesive, and the whole thing fits authentically into the Dead Space universe. One of the main issues with the original is that although the first few hours are pretty scary, it fails to maintain this throughout the campaign. This is a pretty tall order for any game, and I honestly can't think of a single game that was scary from beginning to end. The problem with the original is that it's very formulaic. It relies heavily on the same patterns to scare you, to the point where it becomes easy to pick when a jump scare or a scary moment is likely to happen. The remake definitely benefits from nicer visuals and audio, although if you've played it before, it's not particularly scary. There were a few moments that made me jump, and it's still quite tense, but it's nothing like my first time. Many of the legacy jump scares and creepy moments have been faithfully recreated, and you experience them in the same predictable ways. There's still some unpredictability with enemy encounters, which keeps you on your toes, and the zero-G sections and new puzzles do provide some fresh scares. Holistically though, as a returning player, it's a less intense experience. If this is your first trip to the Ishimura though, you're in for a treat. It's darker and more visceral than ever, and the sound design, particularly the new 3D audio, is superb. This is a must-play with a decent headset.
There's emergency vent controls at the security checkpoint. So, I'll try to lock them out.
I think it's worth clarifying whether this is a remake or a remaster, because I'm sure that many of you are hoping for a Resident Evil 2 style makeover. The official statement says that it's a remake, not a remaster, but I think it sits somewhere in between. For example, the Resident Evil 2 remake is a proper remake. It keeps the fundamentals of the original, but it reimagines how it looks and plays to the point where it's a very different game. Dead Space, on the other hand, is not a reimagining. It's essentially a better looking version of the original that's very similar to play. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a low effort cash grab. No. Motive didn't just up the resolution, increase the frame rate and call it a day. They rebuilt the entire game from scratch in the Frostbite engine, so every asset, animation, character model and area was recreated. Even the enemy AI was redone. This was clearly a massive job that required skill, hard work and many hours, and this is why it's called a remake. Playing it though doesn't necessarily feel like a remake, and that's not inherently a bad thing. Look, all I'm trying to do here is set your expectations. If you're expecting a complete reimagining, then you'll be disappointed. Having said that, this isn't just a better looking version of the 2008 game. There's heaps of new stuff in it, and while none of it alters the experience to the point of it feeling like an entirely new game, the changes that have been made do allow for it to be played in entirely new ways. I think a good way to describe it is like a director's cut, something along the lines of Aliens. The changes simply add to the experience and flesh it out with more story and gameplay. It doesn't change the core experience, it just gives you a new way to enjoy it. I should also mention that it has remained a single player only game, and as of the making of this review, there are no microtransactions or DLC to purchase. The original Dead Space came out 14 years ago, and while a lot of its presentation looks like a 7th gen title, it still holds up. Back in 2008, it was mind-blowing, so the remake couldn't just look good, it had to be cutting edge. Yeah, I have no complaints, this is a very pretty game to look at. Now, a common criticism of the original is that the level design lacked variety. With the exception of a few locations, the vast majority of the spaces look the same. There's certainly still an element of that here, it is using the same level design after all, but each area is more distinct this time. Environments are more detailed and dense, and they're also more grotesque. There's blood and entrails on just about every surface, and the presentation is so much juicier than its predecessor. Games of the 7th generation were never able to pull off this look convincingly. Things always looked a bit too shiny or plastic-like. There's none of that here, and this is one of the reasons the remake is more visceral. Anyone who's watched my review of the first game will know that the menus were something I didn't love. They may have looked high-tech and futuristic back in 2008, but they've aged like milk and were cumbersome to use. Turns out I wasn't the only one who thought so. Okay, so they aren't dramatically different, but they have been refined to be more usable. It's a subtle change, but an effective one that should make the UI more accessible. And speaking of accessibility, there are some new options that allow you to customize the experience. You can change font sizes, adjust for color blindness, toggle the aim assist, and there's a story mode setting too. I especially like the menu narration feature, and it's clear that accessibility was a priority during development. The only thing I can complain about as far as the presentation is concerned is some of the facial animations. I'm guessing that there wasn't any existing mocap data to pull from, like what was done with The Last of Us Part 1, and recapturing all of the performances was probably considered more effort than what it was worth. It's not really a big deal considering that you generally only see faces at a distance or at a small size, and they're not terrible. They just don't look as convincing as they do in some of the remake's next-gen contemporaries, and it stands out at times compared to the rest of the presentation. On console, there are two different visual settings in the menu that are quite different. Performance runs the game at 60 frames per second with a max resolution of 2K, and that's what most of my gameplay in this review is captured at. Quality is the other setting, and it runs the game at 30 frames per second with a max resolution of 4K, and it also includes ray tracing. There's a decent bump in fidelity in this mode, and ray tracing adds an obvious increase to overall image depth. I'm not going to lie, quality looks really nice, but I chose performance because 60 frames per second just feels superior to play. The trade-off with all of the visual improvements is that this new Dead Space is not a cross-platform title. You'll need an Xbox Series, a PS5, or a fancy gaming rig to play it.
Warning. Thermodynamic purifiers malfunctioning. Stand clear of filtration tubes.
In short, the Dead Space remake is awesome and you should play it. It takes a 14-year-old game and uplifts it to modern standards without losing what made the original so special. It's not just a better looking game either. Thoughtful improvements to its mechanics and systems give you more control and more ways to play it than ever before. There's additional story and lore too, and the decision to have Isaac talk makes the campaign more engaging. And when you factor all of this in, it's a substantially larger game than the original. Sure, it's not that scary for returning players, however for newcomers, I think this will be undoubtedly one of the scariest entries in the franchise. But even if it isn't that scary, the atmosphere is so well done that simply exploring the Ishimura and taking in all the details is a trip definitely worth taking. Dead Space is back.